Hi guys, thanks for joining me for another photo editing tutorial. In this one we're going to take a look at how to post-process interior architecture shots. Now I've done a few videos on editing architecture and they always come with a whole host of questions from you guys in the comments. So I thought I'd do another video for you and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of those questions along the way. In the past, I've shown how I use Aurora to create HDR images in a nice, natural and believable way. But in this tutorial, what we're going to look at is how I actually use exposure blending within Photoshop. I haven't used any flash while I was on location. Everything was shot as is with the lights that are there and available to us. So we'll look at the set of photographs I took while I was there and how I'm going to actually use them to composite the best of probably 3 shots into one, and then how I actually finish that image so that I'm good to give that back to the client and they can then put that into their portfolio, enter it into the awards, that sort of thing. So let's jump into Lightroom now. I'll show you what I photographed and I'll just talk you through a little bit behind the background of me actually capturing these shots, and then we'll start post-producing them and we'll go from there. Okay, so in front of us here in the library module, you can see the photographs that I captured, and you'll see these numbers here in the top left. You'll see that they're actually part of sets of images that I took. So for any one photograph, I actually took a series of 5 bracketed images. So for this particular one, if we just open this up, the idea is that you have a base shot that's going to cover your base exposure, and then you're going to have a dark exposure running right through to a light exposure. So we've got information for through the windows here in this shot, but obviously the kitchen is too dark, and in say this image we've got a much better exposure on the kitchen, and we've got like an even brighter one if we want to bring up more details in these shadows and the detail on the cabinetry. But how do you actually do that in practice? Well, let's take a look. This is the photo that we're going to be working on today, and what you can see in front of you at the moment is the proof that I send through to the client, and this is created very, very quickly. There's an awful lot wrong with this photo at the moment, but this is, as I say, a proof image which is basically intended to be good enough that the client can judge by looking at this whether or not they want to invest in licensing this image from me. If I jump into this folder here, which is KD Kitchen, these are the images that I took that were not licensed. So I like to give my client a few options. The more options you can present to them, the more they're likely to invest in. And you can see from the images that we've got here, we've got 13 selects, and the ones that she didn't want, there's only 6 of those. So that's a pretty good hit rate that we've got going on there. That means a happier client because they've got more to add to their portfolio or potentially enter into design awards. But also that's much, much better for us as photographers because we can get paid more for the licensing. So let me open up this block of 12 images here, this stack, and let's take a look at what I've got. These 3 photographs here, if I just bring those up by pressing the N key, these are all the same photo. So on the left here, we have what I've sent through as a proof. This center shot here, this is exactly as it is straight out of camera. So you can see between the 2 of these, if I remove that one, you can see that we've actually got a big improvement on the left in terms of sending something through to the client for the proof, but it was done so quickly. So let me quickly show you how I created this. When I first bring the photos into Lightroom, I need to get them looking pretty good pretty quickly. So the best thing to do is to build a preset. Here I've got my import proof full dynamic range preset, and that's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting of processing this photo for us. If I drop down the basic panel here, this is where most of the work's done. Basically we increase the contrast and we drop the highlights all the way, push the shadows all the way up, and that's just going to increase the dynamic range. It's not going to look great, but it's certainly going to get the photo in a place where the client can judge the potential for this photo. So the only things I need to do now that I'm in charge of is basically choosing the white balance. So I'll have my color picker here, and I'm going to choose a neutral point somewhere in the gray tones something around here should be pretty good. I feel like we're a little bit warm, but in the proofing stage, I'm not too worried about that. And the next key thing that we need to do is just straighten our lines. So I like to do that in the transform box here and come to the guided option. And basically we're going to draw 4 lines around the as far close to the edge of the frame as you can get. So here's our first line. Probably let's put it on the edge of the fridge so we can actually say that's definitely supposed to be a straight line. And then we choose another one over this side. So let's use the wall here. We know that should be straight. And so straight away we see that pop, and now we've got our verticals nice and straight. Now we need to work on our horizontals. So we could use the top of the ceiling line here where it meets the wall. That's one. And the next one, you could think, oh, well, I'll just do the bottom here. But it's much more accurate to go to as close to the edge of the frame as possible. So we've got the tiling work here that we can use. And boom, we have a nicely straightened image. So I'm happy with that as a proof. So that can go off to the client. So now they've come back to us and said, yes, I would like to purchase the license to this photo. Please make it look awesome for me. What we're going to do is create a version which is more authentic to the original. So something like this. Now this image looks much more believable in terms of how it actually was in the scene, but you can see we're blowing out our highlights here where we've got a strip light underneath the extractor fan here. We're also blowing out our highlights under here, and there's not much interest going on in the ceiling. You'll also see that there's a really hard shadow line here as well, and all of those kind of things just they don't look great. So I actually took another series of images. So this was my first set of 5. If I show you those, if you want to look at all of your images together, just select them and just press the N key. So this is just running through a selection of bracketed photos. So we have our base exposure. The second one is 2 stops underexposed. So that'll be great for bringing back these details in the highlights here. And then we've got all the way to 2 stops overexposed. From here I turned the lights on and I got another set of images. So we've got the lights overhead here, but there are certain things that I don't really like with these lights on. The benefit is we've got rid of that hard shadow line on the floor, but we've introduced these little hot spots up here on the wall, which I don't really like. And there's also a bit of a glossy reflection off the wood here, and it's probably a better look with the wood like this, a little more uniform. So we're going to combine the best of both of these photos together using that luminosity blending that I spoke about before. So when I talk about luminosity blending, all we're talking about is just combining highlights and shadows into one cohesive image. Now, I've shown you before how much I love using Aurora to do this because it's all automated. But some people do prefer the manual approach of doing it yourself in Photoshop. And for me, I use both options. It just depends which one I feel like is going to work better for a particular image. And normally you're only going to know that by trial and error and just working on lots and lots of your own photos to get a feel for that. So what I would like to do is use a base exposure from the image that doesn't have the lights on here. We're going to use a base exposure from the image that does have the lights on, and we're also going to use an image that we can use for the controlling the highlights, and I think this would be a really good option for that. So I'm just going to select these 3 images, 1, 2 and 3. I'm going to right click and go to Edit In and Open as Smart Object in Photoshop. So here they are in Photoshop now, and we can see we've got 3 versions, but they're all separate files. So what I like to do is just drag one of them down, and that can be our base exposure. Then we can just press the V key, and we can hold Shift and drop that into there, close that down. And this base layer here, we can hold Shift and drop that in as well, and close that down. And now we've got 3 layers all together. There's a quicker way to load 3 layers all into one file, but unfortunately if you want to keep them active as editable smart objects, unfortunately you need to do that that way. Unless somebody else knows another way that's quicker, please let me know if you do. So now let's make this full screen. Let's zoom in, press F to get our tools back and our layers palette, and let's have a look at these layers. So this is a good starting point for a base exposure. I really like what's going on here. This is actually probably my favorite exposure here, and now this can control the highlights. So let's work with these two top layers, and let me show you how this luminosity blending can work. So basically this photo here, it's very dull and flat and washed out, it's underexposed, but the good thing about it is it's got all the details in the highlights here, in the lights, they're not blooming at all. And underneath here we've also got the granite detail as well. So what we need to do to combine this layer with the one underneath, the best of both worlds, is we need to put a mask on this top layer. Currently everything is showing through because our mask is white, and what we need to do is just hide this currently and come up to image, apply image, and just click OK. We're basically creating a black and white luminosity version of the photo based on this particular layer here. And if we turn this on, we can now see basically all we're doing is bringing in the highlights from this image. If you want it to affect a tighter area of the highlights, you can run that one more time. You can go to image, apply image, and now it's just darkened down that mask even more. And so it's got a slightly more subtle effect. So if we hide it and show it, that's great. Now the next thing that we want to be mindful of is it's actually kind of flattening out the whole image through areas in the midtones as well. I don't really want that. I just want to use it for protecting the highlights. So what I'm going to do is actually create a little group to drop this into. It's all on its own in this group, but the brilliant thing with this is I can now create a double mask. I can mask this group, so I'll put another mask on there. I've got my default colors at the moment, white and black, and because black is the back color, what I can do is just press Control Delete, and that's filled the mask with black. So currently we see none of what's inside this group, and now we can just get our brush and paint with white where we want these highlights controlled. So I will just click and start painting, and just like magic, you can see that we are controlling our highlights. This bit underneath the range hood here, this is going to be a lot of fun to paint this back in. Yeah, look at that, isn't that great? And the other problem area we've got is underneath here on the granite, so we can just paint down there, and we've got all our detail back in the highlights. And let's also just paint there because that blue color was just going a little bit too bleached out. It's quite a long video today. I'm trying to pack in a lot for you guys and trying to show you everything. So if you're enjoying it, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. That would mean a lot to me. If you're interested in architectural photography, let me know in the comments, because if I know that that's what people are wanting to watch, I'll create more stuff geared towards you on that. So yeah, cheers. Let's get back to it. Let's paint that in over here where the reflections are on the wood there, because we don't want to draw the eye too much to that. And now with our base layer that we've got here, let's drag that to the top of the pile just so we can see what's going on with that. And if we turn that off and on, we can, what I'm doing now is just looking at the picture and seeing, okay, what is there in this particular frame that I would like to add to the image. First of all, you can see that there's a slight shift in color temperature. So the color toning is just slightly different between these two. So the way we'll handle that is we'll come to our drop down box here and we'll change it to luminosity. So now we've got the brightness value of this layer, but the colors now are from what was underneath. So if I turn it to normal, you can see that's the colors from this particular layer. And now I'll turn it to luminosity. And now we have no new color cast, which is great. So I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, what do I like in this image? What is better in this layer than in this layer? And for me, there's not a whole heap, but I do prefer what's going on in this top left-hand corner. So let's mask this and we can paint that back in just up there. So we've got our black mask. I'm going to come to the paintbrush tool, select white, and using my bracket keys, I'm just making my brush a bit smaller. Sorry, I'm making it a bit bigger. And now I can just paint over this area here. I've got a low flow of sort of 20%, so we can drop the opacity as well, just so we've got a little bit more fine tuning with this. And I'm just painting over, and now we're getting the best of both worlds. See, we're not bleaching out on this bit up here either. So we've got a hint of those lights hitting this, but it's not so bright, not so in your face. I may even do the same just on this wall here, just click once, twice maybe, where the light's hitting that. And I think at the top of the fridge too, we'll just paint that in as well, because that's just a little distracting, that little highlight up there. Now if we hold the Alt key or Option on the Mac and we click the eyeball here, you can see that this was our before and this is our after, and we've just managed to just control all of those highlights. So the designer, she'll be very happy because all of her hard work and all of these details, it's all visible still in our photo, and we've still got quite a nice punchy photo. So what I would like to do now is just a couple of things really. I feel like the black wood at the top here is actually just a little bit too bright. I want to keep all of the detail and texture there, but I want to dull that down. So I can do that using a mask and maybe use a curve or levels just to darken that. And this area here is looking a little dark, so we might want to lighten that part up just so that we do see the detail in the cupboards here. And then as a final touch, I'm just going to run a plugin on it, which is basically going to give the image a lot more pop and just make it look much more appealing. And the final thing that I think I would like to fix is there's just a little bit of yellow toning on the marble tiles down here, and I think that's just coming from the color cast where the light's hitting the inside of this cooker range hood here, this area, and that's just sort of reflecting that yellow down there. And that's the sort of detail that I think you really need to pay attention to when you're delivering work to architects and designers. You need to be aware of that kind of thing, because that is the sort of stuff that elevates you from, say, a real estate photographer. I had a comment from somebody just today, and they were saying to me they couldn't believe how much I was charging and that the clients were willing to pay that amount for the work I was doing. Maybe not the work I was doing, but they were saying it was very difficult in their particular area to make that kind of money. And I would kind of push back on that and actually say that it's more about what you're delivering to a client. If you want to charge more than a real estate photographer, you need to make sure that your work is worthy of being paid more. So it's the little details that a real estate photographer is not going to fuss over and not going to care over, because they're not being paid enough to worry about it. And that's the sort of stuff that if you want to get paid more, you need to pay attention to. So now I've spotted that this is a little bit yellow orange down here on the marble floor. We need to address that. So let's quickly do that now, and we can move on to the next step. For this, I'm just going to use a quick selection, choose my layer, and I'm just going to start dragging this over the tiled floor here and around the corner. So we pick this up as well, and that's going to be close enough just for a slight color correction. We don't need to be perfect on this. So there's heaps of ways you could do this within Photoshop, but what I'm going to do is just sample a color from the tile up here, and we're basically going to create a new layer. And we'll change the blend mode to color, and we're literally just going to paint over the top of this area that we don't really like. So we've got our paintbrush, we'll actually bump the opacity much higher, and I can use the bracket keys to make it a nice big brush. And you can see as I start to paint, we're getting rid of that color cast. And if we look at that layer, if I just hold the Alt key again, you know, we've literally just painted a grey over that area, and this is without it and this is with it. We've just dulled that down, which is quite nice. And if you want to finesse that, you can just select another colour close to where you're painting and just introduce that as well. And I'll say I'm happy with that. I like to be organised, so we'll just call that layer Colour Tiles, deselect that mask and move on. Now the next thing I'm going to do is just mask out this area up here on the wood so that I can darken it down. And we could use the polygonal lasso tool and kind of click around, but I actually find it's too easy to sort of double click by mistake and you've closed off your selection, and you have to like kind of start adding to it again. I just find it as a messy way to work with that tool. So I much prefer the control that you get with the pen tool. So let's select our pen tool here, zoom in, Control D will deselect what we just had there, and we don't need to be like super precise, but I think the pen tool is pretty good at actually allowing us to be pretty precise. So I'm just clicking on these edges, and when I want to move the photo around, I'm just holding the space bar and then clicking and dragging my mouse. So we're just going to select all of this area of wood. So we've got our first part there, and now we'll also get this bit of the cupboard over here. If you want to be more precise, zoom in slightly. And I'm actually going to just sort of feather off this bit here. So I'm not going to worry about masking out these handles at the moment, because we won't actually apply our effect there. It is literally the top part of these cupboards that I'm finding too bright. So now we've made a pen selection. We can come over to the paths, and it says work paths with italic writing. Double click that, and we'll just call that cupboards. By double clicking it and giving it a name, we're actually telling Photoshop this is an important selection, keep it. Whereas if it was a work path and you started creating another path, you would lose that original path. So to turn this into a selection, all we need to do is hold the Control key and just click on that. And now we can zoom out. So I'm just using the Control, Alt and Spacebar to get my magnifying glass. That's Control, Option and Spacebar on a Mac. And now what we're going to do is create a curves layer that just darkens everything. So all we need to do is grab that and just pull it down slightly. We can be relatively aggressive with this because we can again remove it from areas we don't really want it. So again, we can double mask it by creating a group, drop it in that group and mask the group. We can press Alt Delete this time, sorry, Control Delete to fill it with black. And now I'm going to get Paintbrush, and I can use white to paint back in this dark effect that we've created. So let's drop our opacity so that we can build it up in a couple of layers. Now I have a Wacom tablet, and it's much easier to work with a tablet when you're doing this sort of thing, but currently I'm just clicking with my mouse, and because we've done all the hard work of masking and everything, you can achieve these kind of results very easily with a mouse. So if we turn that off and on, you can see that we're just adding that nice pop of contrast that is actually there with that black and white combination in the kitchen. We can brighten this area here by basically doing the same thing, but this time our curve is going to go up, not down. So let's boost this up. Currently we don't see too much because it's dropped it into this group that we created. So let's drag it up above. And now you can see we've got a much brighter image all over, but I don't want this everywhere. I just want it over this cupboard here. I may even just boost that up a little bit more in the darks and the shadows. Happy with that. So let's now press Control and Delete to fill that with black, and we can just paint here just to bring that brightening effect in. Brighten up that little area there where it was just almost dropping off to black. And if there are other areas where you feel like things are just a little bit too dark, we can use this curve and just brighten them up. So maybe this shadow down here is just feeling a little bit too heavy, so we just paint over that, and it's just brightening that up nicely as well. Using curves in conjunction with masks is a really nice way to guide the viewer's eye. So I mean, I might like to just do a strip down the middle of brightening, just to kind of lead your eye into the middle of these tiles here. So if I turn that off and on, we're just brightening that area as well. We may want to do the same on the ceiling, just around the lights. We could just slightly give them a little brightening, just brighten that ceiling up. Okay, we're looking great. So there's just one more thing we want to do before we take this into our finishing part of the edit. So that is just retouching anything we're not happy with. So I'm going to create a whole new layer that's a stamp visible layer, and the monster shortcut key that allowed me to create this layer here is Control Shift Alt and E. So, or Control Shift Option E on a Mac, and that has enabled us to put everything down here into one single layer, which is great for retouching. So you can see that we've got these little light fairies coming on up here, just this little green bit here, so we just need to remove those really. And the spot healing brush tool is a pretty cool tool to do that with, because we can just click once and say, see you later pal, see you later pal, look for any more. There's a slight discoloration there with that, get rid of that. There's a little brightening here that I feel we need to get rid of as well, so let's just paint over that area there. And if we create any more abnormalities, we can just go over them again. And then what I like to do is just look around the frame and just see if there's anything that shouldn't be there, or anything that does need just a little retouch. Like for example, there's a plant behind here, but we can only see a tiny little bit of it poking through, and I think we'd probably be better off if we actually just get rid of that. So that's done a pretty good job, but not perfect. So let's click again, let's click there, and then this area here. Cool. So let's look at our before and our after. That's gone, great. As we look down here, you can see that there's another little area that might need just touching up. It's these kind of attention to detail that I think clients like architects and designers, they just really appreciate this. You don't have to do all of this level of editing really, but I think going back to that point, if you want to get paid more and attract the right kind of clients who will pay more, you need to take this kind of care and attention. It's very rare that you'll get a, oh thank you, I love what you've done with that image, that looks really great. Don't expect that, because they just expect that the photo you're providing looks perfect. The thank you is the paycheck. So this layer, I'm going to call it retouch, just to keep organized. I would normally go through and name all of my layers just to make sure that everything was really well organized, and if I need to go back and alter anything, I know exactly what is what in the file. So now for the really fun part, we're going to use Luminar to just process the last little bits of this. We don't need to do too much, and I'm sure if you sent this through to a client exactly as it is, maybe with a little bit of sharpening, they'd probably be pretty happy. But we want to take things to the next level. We want to get paid more for what we do, so we need to find that point of difference. So let's open up Luminar, because I think that's a tool that we can enable. It's really cool tools just to actually give us something that's that next level. So Luminar is now loading up and bringing that layer in for editing. Now I do have a preset, or what's known as a look, that I could throw onto this straight away to make it look pretty fantastic, but what I'm going to do is actually show you how I build a look. You can see all these different architectural looks down at the bottom here, but let's build something from scratch. Let's hide those looks again, and let's use the AI Enhance tool. AI Accent, I find this is actually a really cool tool for enhancing architecture. Architecture just sort of lends itself really well to a lot of these tools. Things like structure and AI accents, sometimes they're a little bit too much when you've got people in your shots, so use them with more caution in those cases. But for architecture, you can push things pretty high. So you can see just by applying this AI Enhance, if I turn it off and on, it's making some really nice intelligent changes already. It's increasing saturation where we want it, it's increasing contrast in an intelligent way, it's looking at localized contrast and global contrast, all with this one slider. Now, let me push it too far, let's go to 100 just so you can really see what it's doing. So this is before and this is after. So yeah, it's too much like that, but you can see where it's headed. And so let's leave that around 30 and come into AI structure. So this is going to give us a similar sort of look to what clarity does. So if we increase that, again, you can see it's far too much at 100, but I just want to push it all that way so that you can see exactly what this filter is doing. Any one of these filters can be painted in using the mask, so we could just hide this effect and then just paint it back where we want it. So if we wanted to accentuate the marble on the bench top here, we could just paint it back in here. But let's leave everything global for now. So let's bring that all the way down, maybe somewhere around 20. I don't usually vignette my architectural shots, but as in this one, because it's a 1-point perspective, we're kind of being led down the eye line of the kitchen straight to the center point. Let's just put a little darkening on the edges. So nothing too much. without and with, very subtle, but it just helps to lead our eye right into the center of the frame. We could even use Luminar's very cool inner light feature, which is basically just going to brighten that center point. So push it all the way to 100, you can see what it's doing, brightening that area, but we could just add a little bit of that. There we go. So if we turn our vignette off and on, it's just helping to lead our eye. That's looking good. Let's jump into the creative tab, and this is just something that I like to do, but I like the mystical filter. Let me show you 100% and you'll be like, whoa, what's going on there? Far too much, but it's giving this soft hazy look, but obviously I'd never put all of that on there, but we could maybe just use 5%, 10%, something like that. Let's turn it off and on. So it's just adding a sort of dreamy quality, but in such a low amount that it's hardly noticeable. You wouldn't even know that that's there now. But if we look at our before and after, it's just adding a little something something. There are other things you can do, like create a bit of a dramatic look. If I push that to 100, you'll see that we get a very monotone, high contrast look. And if you're wanting to subdue the color cast in any way on, say, white walls, you can add some of that, and that will actually help to achieve that effect. So, you know, maybe we'll tickle that in at around 6. Use the toggle switch to see before and after, and you can see that everything I'm doing is really subtle at the moment. And if we get to the end and we decide that our effect is just too strong, we can change the whole effect with just one slider, which is really, really great. Wasn't available in Luminar 4, but now in version 4.2, it is there, and I really love it. Let's come into the Pro tab, and I will just demonstrate to you how you can use masks to actually fine-tune your changes. So let's do something with the advanced contrast. Let's get the highlights contrast, and if I push that all the way to the right, you're seeing a bit of a trend here. I like to push things to the right, see exactly what they're doing. You can see that it's actually increasing the color saturation in the yellow range hood here and the blue that we've got coming on over here. So I certainly don't want to apply that through my whole image, but there probably are areas where I'd quite like this. So for example, on the right hand side through the center here, and on the left here with the yellows. So let's reduce the opacity to about 50%, and we're just going to click Edit Mask, click Brush, and we're going to be painting this effect in. And just like Photoshop, you can use the bracket keys on your keyboard to control the size of your brush. Now you'll see as I start to paint that yellow is now coming in there. So if we turn this off and on, you'll see we've increased the saturation through there. And let's do the same with this sort of blue area through here. So that's off and on. And I'm just going to take it away from on the bench top a little bit so we can erase that now. Bring the brush size down, the brush size. There we go. Now there are other tools within here that we could play around with, but I'm going to say I'm happy with that for now. But let's just have a look at our before and our after. You see how much more pop we're getting with this? So the eye tool here, before, after, before, after. See, I'm starting to notice in the bottom right the color cast here on this part of the marble. If we look at our before and after, it becomes more evident, I think, in this edit. So what we could do is actually just come back to our Essentials tab, and in the color section, see, we can reduce the saturation. We could even be more color specific, go Advanced Settings, Yellow, and reduce the yellowing in that. And obviously we don't want to apply that to anything other than this area here. We may even just sort of brighten that area up just a little bit. And we'll just go Edit Mask, choose Brush, and we are just going to paint that in over this area here. So if we hide that and turn it on, you'll see that we're sort of neutralizing the end part of that bench there, which is nice. If we're happy with this edit, we've got a couple of options. We could either say, okay, we're happy with the look, but we want to reduce the opacity of that slightly. And to do that, we just click this layer icon in the top right here, and that allows us to come to this amount slider, and we can drop that from 0 to 100 and just sort of play around with that slider until you feel that you're happy with the look that you've got. Another option is to say we want to keep it at 100% and apply it, and then we're going to use Photoshop and the opacity slider within Photoshop. So we've got options, so it's a really nice tool to have at our disposal and really elevate the look of our photo, but in a way that we've still got full control over it. So now we're back inside Photoshop, and here is our layer, and if we turn this off and on, you can see exactly what it's doing. And I'd recommend just looking around the frame and saying, where do I like this effect? Where do I not like the effect? And I like it in most of the frame, to be honest. I just want to reduce the opacity down so it's just a little more subtle. So maybe we'll go around sort of 50%. So before and after, I like that. And we're just going to add a mask, and we can now remove it from the areas that I don't quite like it, and that is literally just this little bit here. If I turn it off and on, I just feel like it's muddying up the corner of this bit of wall here. So what we could do is just use our quick mask tool and literally just paint black into this area here. I've just pressed 0 to change my opacity to 100%. And there we go, it's not affecting that bit of the wall anymore. And we can even, if we wanted to, just lighten that bit by selecting a color from up here, and let's create a new layer. And there we go, we can just brighten that bit of the wall up as well. If you're into architectural photography and you're watching this, I'm sure you know all about sharpening, but let me just show you a technique that I quite like. So let's create another stamp visible layer with that monster shortcut, Shift, Control, Alt and E. And now we're going to change this layer here that we are going to call sharpening to a linear light. Let's go for linear light for now. We might change that later, but now we come to filter, other and high pass, and we're going to use the high pass filter for our sharpening. So if we zoom into those flowers, and now we just need to play around with the radius. If I push it all the way, you can see what it's doing at larger radiuses. You just want to keep this really low, somewhere around that sort of like 0.8, 1, something like that. Depends on the photo you're working on. It also depends on the sharpness of your lens, the sensor, and also the area of the image you're applying it to, because we could run 2 sharpening filters, one for the sort of mid to background that we might keep to quite a low radius, and then we could always run another sharpening filter which is with a slightly wider radius to take care of the things that are slightly more out of focus in the foreground. But for this example, let's click OK and say done. So let's have a quick look at this area through here. This is without the sharpening, this is with the sharpening, and the great thing with that being on this grey layer here, if we turn it to normal, if you've got areas where you don't want the sharpening, you can just paint with grey and get rid of it. And if you like the effect but you feel that linear light is too strong, you can actually change it to, let's say, overlay, and that's not quite as strong effect. I think for this particular photo, let's keep it in linear light and just drop the opacity ever so slightly. I'd just like to point out I probably would do a little more cleanup on this during that retouching phase. I probably would have got rid of some of these little marks here, but just for the sake of the video, we're going to say that's done and look at our original and where we've ended up. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. I know that was quite a long video, but I really wanted to share with you as much as I could about that process. So I really hope you've got something out of it. If you have, do me a favor, just hit the thumbs up button if you haven't already. And if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel. So just as a really quick overview for you of what we covered, basically we looked at how to proof your photo back to your client quickly so that everything's pretty much automated because you're building a preset. And then all you're doing is just correcting the white balance and correcting the verticals and the horizontals. Once your client comes back to you and says, yes, that photo, I want that, please process that for me, you go into your bracketed set, and I do recommend, if you're on site, shoot a bracket of probably 5 images. It's just CYA, cover your ass. You don't want to get back home and realize that you don't have an exposure for the brightest highlights or the deepest shadows. You can always disregard photos, which is what we did here. We ended up using 3 photos and combining those using luminosity masks in Photoshop. And that's really, really easy. All you're doing is putting a mask on, say the photo that's controlling the highlights, and that mask is done by going to Image, Apply Image in the menu, and just make sure that the default settings are there, and you will see that you create a luminosity mask based on the brightness of the photo. So that's a really great thing to know. You don't need to go diving into the channels and selecting things from the channels. Just apply image, done. It can be a little bit longer than using HDR, using Aurora, for example, that I've showed you before, but it does give you more control, and so that's a really nice thing. And then the final piece of the puzzle for me is I use a filter called Luminar. It's a standalone program, but I use it as a plugin when I'm working on my architectural stuff, and I just enhance things just that little bit further using the tools that are available to me there. I do have a couple of presets I've built, or they call them looks in Luminar, that actually kind of do all of what I just showed you, like in a split second, and then you just export that file and you're pretty much done. No, scratch that, you are done at that point. All you need to do is send that through to your client and send them the bill. So that's the nice bit as well. So guys, hey, thanks so much for watching. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. If you follow my videos, you'll see I do write back to everybody, and it means a lot to me to get a comment, even if it's just a hey, cheers for the video or whatever. But yeah, if you've got a question, leave it below. And if you do want to get hold of Luminar, I've got a discount code that can get you $10 off at the checkout, and that is @Sky10. So help yourself to that, guys. Cheers, and I shall see you in the next video.